My name's Shannon Finch, and I'm very privileged to have served as a Director of Muscular Dystrophy New South Wales for about 8 years. And for my sins, I'm also a corporate lawyer who's part of a global firm that happens to specialise in royal commissions. So Christy and Christina seized on that to persuade me to chat to you today. I did have quite a lot of involvement with the processes around the Financial Services Royal Commission, and I'm hoping this one will have a very different character to that one. So, just to start off with, you'll hear there's lots of legalese around these sorts of legal processes and inquiries. And one of the first things people ask is, well, what actually is a Royal Commission in the first place? Why are we doing this? And a Royal Commission, the hint is in the title. It's actually something called by the representative of the Crown. So this is Queen Elizabeth's Governor-General calls the Royal Commission on the recommendation of Parliament. So when there is an issue of great public importance, a Royal Commission is the highest form of inquiry that we have. So the first signal is when a Royal Commission is called, this is a signal that people are taking the issue very, very seriously. They appreciate the weight of it. And the thing that makes Royal Commissions different to courts is that they have different powers and much more aggressive powers. So they can require people to answer questions, to attend and give evidence, and they do not apply the sorts of procedural rules that courts have to apply when they're asking people questions or asking them to give evidence. And that opens up the material that can come forward. Court processes are very caught up in rules that protect the people giving evidence. In a Royal Commission, there are no protections of that kind for the people giving evidence. It's a very, very different process. We did see that in the Financial Services Royal Commission. You saw people being questioned in a way that they could never be questioned in a court of law. So there's a real significance to this process being undertaken outside the court system. The flip side of that, though, is that you have to expect that a Royal Commission will only come up with findings and make recommendations. It will not resolve any of the matters that are brought before it. So it investigates, it makes recommendations to government, but it doesn't, for instance, award damages. It doesn't make a decision that a particular person is liable for anything. So you will see it as almost a sort of storytelling process. It's about bringing issues to light and making recommendations about what to do. But it doesn't mean that you will come out of it finding that there are findings that a particular institution has to pay damages or compensation to people who are affected, and it doesn't automatically change the laws. All it can do is make recommendations. It's then back over to government to decide what to do with the output of the Royal Commission. But it's a pretty tough thing for a government to go against the findings of a Royal Commission. Not unheard of, but because it is our highest form of inquiry, it puts a lot of pressure on government. Now, some Royal Commissions can actually run for many, many years. You saw the Financial Services Royal Commission set a very short time frame, and there was a lot of criticism of that because the pressure that it put on individuals who are actually supporting the work of the Commission was almost intolerable. So you'll find for this Royal Commission they have a more expanded time frame. And you'll find it will report within a couple of years, but it is always possible for these things to be extended. So we're in the very early stages of this one at the moment. And if you're thinking about what led to it, the time that the Royal Commission takes is nothing compared to the time it took to get us to this point. So it's been a very long journey to get us to the stage of the Royal Commission actually being called. If you think back to it, the Richmond report, which was on the abuses within asylums and the recommendations to move away from that system of caring for people with disability, was right back in 1983. And so there were then reports in 2008 of sexual assaults at a Uralla group home, and it was really that scandal where the seeds for this Royal Commission sat, the shock that came out of that. But it has still taken an extraordinary period of time to get to the point where a Royal Commission is called. That should be a source of shame for our governments, but at least we're here now. So in March 2019, draft terms of reference were prepared. Now, the importance of the terms of reference, these were open for consultation. The importance of them is that they set the limits for the Royal Commission. Because it has extraordinary powers of inquiry, it has to operate within these defined limits, so the terms of reference are really important. The terms of reference for this one, I think, are pretty good. They're certainly drafted with a view to not setting arbitrary limits on what the Royal Commission can consider. And in many ways, they are more thoughtful than the terms of reference I've seen for other commissions. But those were important, and they were made available for consultation to members of the public so that people could have input into them. And then in April 2019, the Prime Minister announces the Royal Commission, and the Governor-General issues the letters of patent, which are effectively the royal seal on proceeding. The commissioners are some very eminent people. They have experience in the justice system, within the public sector, in the disability sector. There are First Nations people represented. There's some real thought has gone into the composition of the commission. There are disability advocates amongst the commissioners, and they divide up the work between themselves. So you'll see some involved in some processes, others involved in others. There will also be people called counsel assisting involved, and those are usually barristers, and they help to present, when we get to the stage of hearings, they help to present evidence to the Royal Commission and to question people who are giving evidence in front of the Commission. But the Commission's being led in particular by the Honourable Ronald Sackville QC, who was a very eminent barrister. He then became a judge of the Federal Court for many years, and then until this Royal Commission commenced, he was an acting judge in the New South Wales Court of Appeal. So he's an incredibly eminent person. The reason they choose someone who's been a judge is that they do know how to direct this sort of process. They have experience in directing inquiries. He's been involved in inquiries and commissions before, so he's a very experienced man. The key dates. So the process has kicked off, but as I mentioned, it's in incredibly early stages. So if you're wondering why there's not a whole lot of information out there about this yet, it's because there is a gentle approach being taken to framing what is going on. It's different to the Financial Services Royal Commission with the banking inquiry. There was actually nothing that came out in that inquiry that wasn't known to regulators before they started. So it was more about making a public display of what was known than about really delving down to find the facts. The facts were all already known. So it was easier for them to frame it, move straight into submissions and public hearings and get on with it, because they already knew what they wanted to expose. It was more I shouldn't say show trial, that would be disrespectful, but it was, it was being conducted for the purposes of highlighting bad behaviour to get a result. This is slightly different because there have been scandals, there have been lots of anecdotal stories about abuses in this sector, but the truth is not really known, and the full scope of it is not really known. And so this commission is taking a very gentle approach, and it's starting with a lot of community consultation. So we've found that workshops have already commenced. They started in June, and they are being held around the country. There have been people like disability advocates meeting with commissioners, a bunch of lawyers that work in community legal sectors and who represent people with disability have been meeting. And there have been some two early workshops now in 2 locations with First Nations people, because the Indigenous community has experienced abuse that combines a number of vulnerabilities and has been particularly exacerbated. So special attention is being given to that sector. And so it's no surprise to see that the Commission is leading off very early with workshops with that community. This is not about fact-finding exactly, it's actually about framing the inquiry so they know how broad they should go and how they should structure the process. Submissions have already opened. So written submissions can be made, and we'll come to this in a minute, but that process is already open, so if you want to, this is something you can already start to engage with. There's no closing date as yet, and we expect that that process will run for quite a period of time. Community forums are about to commence, so on the 9th of September those will kick off, And that will be meetings in the community to explain what the Commission is doing, to hear a very small number of brief statements from people. So you can attend by pre-registering, and if you really want to speak, you can pre-register to speak, but there are limited speaking spots and they're brief statements. It's more about communicating out to the community what is happening. So they're more like briefings really than feedback sessions. They are probably going to encourage people to make submissions rather than provide responses in that particular forum. There's not a whole suite of them planned as yet. Information is going to be put up on a website, so at the moment I think they've just got the first one scheduled, and then they'll start rolling out information about where they're being held. I think the first one might be in Townsville. They're starting up north and then working their way south, I think, and then hopefully west as well. Public sittings will commence in September. The first one is just, again, going to be an information session, and then it will move on to actually scheduling hearing dates where they decide to call people to give evidence. The program for that is not yet set, so they've just given us the first date, which is an information-only session. Then I think as they're starting to frame the inquiries that they're making, they'll set hearing dates going on from there. And you should expect that those may run over a period of possibly a year, maybe even into the following year. So that will be quite a protracted process. And the interim report, so we'll start to get some feedback as to what the Commission is finding. The target date is October 2020. So you can see these processes take a while, and that those dates can be extended if the Commission says we're not quite there yet. And the target date for the final report is April 2022. So we're going to be hearing about this Commission for the next couple of years. So I mentioned the terms of reference. What can this Commission look at? The framing document in that terms of reference, it's available on the website, and there's also an easy-to-read version, which is really great. It's the first time I've seen a Commission doing this. That is a version that is not written in legalese. It's broken down into really sort of distinct concepts, very easy to follow. So if you'd like to browse through the website, you'll find there are different versions of these documents, so that if the legalese is sort of baffling and driving you to distraction, you can actually look at the other version. And I found the other version really helpful personally. So the focus of this Commission is what should governments, institutions and the community, so all three, what should we do? The thing that I like is it started with what do we do? It's talking about action. And it's not just focusing on what should government do, it's looking at what institutions, private institutions, charitable institutions, and the community. So there are steps for everyone to be engaged in this, and the Royal Commission therefore can make recommendations for all three of those segments. Firstly, to better prevent and better protect people with disability from experiencing violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation. Now that first priority, my guess is that is going to dominate this Royal Commission. It needs to. This is what has given rise to this Commission. It's the stories of neglect and abuse and exploitation. So we have to expect that this will be a predominant focus of the Commission. There are some positive focuses though. So that is one of those things. That priority means that we're going to hear some things that are going to be upsetting. And I'll talk through in a moment what to expect, but this is one of those things where there has to be truth-telling as part of these processes. We have to uncover the worst of what we've seen to be able to focus on how to do better and how to improve people's lives. But it does mean going through a very, very negative part of this process. There is a focus, though, for this Commission, and this is different to the Banking Royal Commission, I might add, which was solely focused on the misconduct. This Commission is also trying to focus on positive things. So it says, what else do we have to do to achieve best practice? To encourage people to report this sort of violence and abuse and neglect and exploitation, and to encourage effective investigations and responses to those things. So this is talking about how do we get people out of the mindset of hiding things or of turning a blind eye or just hoping that it will go away. How do we shift the mindset of government and institutions and the community to be focused on reporting, investigating, responding? How do we encourage action? Because it would be great to say that all we want to do is to make sure it never happens again, but it's actually more important, because that's an idyllic world that probably will never exist. It's more important that we understand that we never turn a blind eye to it again? And how do we actually encourage institutions to get on the front foot and do something when they find out about it? And in the world that I live in, I actually think that acknowledging imperfection in societies is important. It's more important sometimes than just setting rules. If you just set rules and you don't think about how do we encourage people to speak up when the rules are broken, then you don't get change. And then finally, it also is going to cover how to promote a more inclusive society that supports the independence of people with disability. There is also in that statement their right to live free from violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation. So that theme is persisting. But in the first part of that, the inclusive society supporting independence is where we get a little bit of window potentially to focus on some of the flaws in NDIS. I'll have to say I don't think that we will find that it gets a lot of attention, because I think the first subject will be so emotive and frankly so important that it will probably push NDIS systemic issues into a smaller space. I know that's going to be a frustration for a lot of people as well, because they are really struggling with the systemic issues with NDIS. But I think it is the natural way of these things that they will focus very much on the first subject. The good things about the way that this Royal Commission were framed. The terms of reference make it clear that it can look at all forms of violence, abuse, neglect, exploitation, whatever the context. It's not setting any limits on that. There's no special definitions that people have to bring it within. It will look at failures and impediments to reporting and investigation and responses, but it will also seek out examples of best practice. So there is the opportunity here, and it's probably important for the process that people call out what they do see as having been examples of best practice. It will look at specific experiences, and that's incredibly important for these sorts of inquiries. Sometimes for organisations like MD New South Wales, it's hard for us because we hear lots of people's stories, but we are not necessarily in a position to tell them. We need the people themselves who've experienced them to tell those stories, because our voice will be seen as anecdotal. We're reporting on instances that we can't give personal testimony about. So this is the time when it's really important for this community to engage, and it's a courageous thing to step forward and tell your stories, but it's really important. It's very important. Personal testimony is so much more powerful from the individuals affected than from the organisations that are working with them and who can only tell the story third hand. The Commission can also look at the critical role of families and carers and advocates and the workforce in providing support. And so that's good because it's actually looking at the whole system. And I think, we see from our work how vital the work done by families and carers is, and understanding the pressures that they are put under. That is part of, if we're going to understand the position of people with disability in a holistic way, we have to look at the whole system, and that includes the systems of support that are informal, not just the formal systems that come from government and institutions. And tellingly, the Royal Commission can also look at findings and recommendations of previous reports and inquiries. So this means that some of the earlier reports that were prepared, and you recall I went back to this in a couple of slides ago, the Senate inquiry into Uralla in particular, this commission is allowed to have regard to what that inquiry found, because not very much was done. And so this commission can look back at that and it can make recommendations about what needs to be done. Oop, I'm going the wrong direction, hang on. Dearie me. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, it can look at all aspects of quality issues, safety of services and informal supports. Again, I tend to think I'm pleased that this is included, but I am probably a little bit sceptical as to the share of attention that it may get. I think it will probably get most focus where it connects into the reasons why violence and exploitation, while abuse was able to occur without intervention. So I suspect there will be that cast to it, but it still does open up the pathway for issues to do with NDIS and the way that it is being implemented to at least be raised. That, you know, they aren't excluded because it can fall within this. And you'll see that it specifically mentions that you can include NDIS in comments and submissions. So that's a really positive sign. It's not government. It was not government saying we really don't want anyone to criticise the NDIS. It is actually possible to do it. The other thing is that this commission takes as broad a view as possible to what forms of disability it will consider. And that's important. One of the categories that it does include is mental health, which is interesting, because I think that's been something that's probably been left in the shadows for a period of time. So it's telling that it's included here. But you shouldn't find that where there has been abuse of someone in a vulnerable position, that their story is excluded because their type of disability doesn't count. There's no type that doesn't count in this commission. And the terms of reference also recognise that people's experience of harm can be multi-layered depending upon lots of different characteristics that they have, whether that's differences in age, whether that's gender orientation, whether it's sexual orientation, whether it's ethnic background, culture, language, sort of First Nations people, all of those sorts of different factors that can affect someone's experience and their vulnerability can be taken into account in framing and making recommendations. And the Commission is being expected to be sensitive to those factors. Again, you're seeing this reflected in the way the Commission's approaching things. There's a lot of community workshops and community forums. This is the Commissioners trying to make sure that they are recognising these sorts of factors in the way that they frame their inquiries. So it's a good sign. If you ever do want to delve into the formal copy of the terms of reference, I would encourage you to, for one reason, is that there are some beautiful statements in it. I mean, it's a very formal and old-fashioned type of document. Letters patent have a way of, given that they're sort of on behalf of the Queen, they have a certain formality to them. But I thought that some of these statements were particularly beautiful, and I liked seeing them in writing. I thought, finally, and I'll leave you to have a little look at those for yourself. You can have a copy of these slides if you'd like to, of course. Please do contact our team if you'd like a copy of them. One of the things that's really telling in this statement is that it recognises that it's important that people with disability are central to the processes that inform best practice decision making. I think that's one of the statements I love the most in this. And again, that's why you are seeing the commissioners working very hard to make sure that they are engaging first with the community before they launch into hearings to tell the community what their experiences have been. And that's important. So what does all of this actually mean? What are we going to see coming out of this process? It will evolve, probably slowly, but I expect that what we'll see is that there is a very heavy emphasis on experiences of violence and abuse and neglect and exploitation, because it is a priority to address them, and the stories about these experiences have been coming for decades with government doing nothing. So that is why I think that will take the first priority on this stage. You will probably see issues explored that are represented by clusters of experience. So on occasions, Royal Commissions will single out a particular individual's story, but it is usual that they will select that story to explore because it is representative of a cluster of stories that they've heard. And so this is why it's very important for lots of members of the community to speak up, because the Commission cannot investigate every submission that they get. They cannot investigate every person's story. They will choose some that they think particularly highlight important issues or representative experiences. And so it actually is important to generate those clusters of stories so that they know which theme to choose to dive into. So even if you make a submission and it's not chosen to be investigated, or it's not, you're not called in to give evidence about it, it doesn't mean that that submission wasn't powerful and necessary, because it may have influenced a theme being chosen. So it's important to speak up. I suspect there may be a tendency to focus on large institutions or organisations that run a number of group homes. just because of the horror of the Uralla stories, and because systemic abuse happens through large systems. But it doesn't mean that that's the only thing that we'll be focused on. I'm hoping that we will get some reflection on the circumstances that leave individual carers and families in a position where they cannot adequately support people with disability, because I think that is another systemic issue. And again, that opens up some of the issues with NDIS. There is, as I say, the scope to look at NDIS issues. I suspect grumbling about the fact that it's clunky and it's slow and the systems are a bit a bit archaic and they don't connect properly with things, sort of problems with administration that are delays and inefficiencies. I shouldn't say that these things are inherent to public administration, but they often are a little bit involved in public administration. That's probably not the sort of story, while it's entirely valid, it's probably not the sort of story that will seize the attention of the Commission. There is, however, the possibility, I think, of raising issues with NDIS that highlight systemic issues, whether that may be issues with the quality of planners that are being used and where planners will override specialist advice in sort of allowing people to get access to equipment and services. Those sorts of things, I think, do actually represent a systemic issue which can lead to neglect, effectively, in this community. So there are issues with the NDIS that I think could be powerfully communicated through to connect to the central themes here. And so in making a submission, if what you want to focus on is an experience with NDIS where you feel it is letting the community down, it's helpful to think about it from that perspective. How does it actually connect with some of those central themes, where it's more than just it's a clunky, inefficient system, to where it's not quite delivering all that it promised. Maybe focus on the areas where it's actually leaving people in a position of heightened vulnerability, because I think that's the sort of theme that's going to connect with this Commission, and I think the substance and the material is there within NDIS. So if you have stories to share on that, please do. As I say, personal stories and actual individual experience are the most telling and the most powerful thing in these processes. It does require a little bit of courage to step forward to tell personal experiences, but I think it's important that we use this opportunity to do it. What you should expect to see coming out of this process. Some of the personal stories that come forward are going to be really distressing, but that honesty is of vital importance to this process. Press coverage tends to focus on the worst aspects, and certainly what we saw from the Financial Services Royal Commission is that there can be misreporting in the media. I don't know that it's deliberate. I think it's actually people don't completely understand the process or how things are brought forward to the Commission, so it's given a strange cast. But the media will tend to seize on sensationalist aspects to what's coming forward. So remember that what you read in the press may not be balanced. And it is also possible that the Royal Commission will have greater emphasis on misconduct than it will on what we can do better, or where there are opportunities for improvement, or where there are examples of best practice. So Royal Commission outputs can kind of bring you down a little bit, because they make you feel like, gee, we're in this world and our community is affected by such terrible things. It can be very sobering and upsetting. Remember that what is brought forward, it's trying to fix the worst conduct. It's not representative of the entire sector, and it won't be representative of your entire experience. So please, if it does start to have you feeling down, reach out for support, and remember that it's not designed to give a balanced view. It's designed to focus on the worst. There will be backlash at people coming out of these stories. This is a time, and it's something our organisation focuses on, this is a really difficult time for people who are working in the disability sector, who are giving their lives to it, and who are incredibly dedicated to what they do. It's going to be hard for families and carers working in this sector, because it will feel like there is enormous amounts of criticism being directed at the sector, and it will feel like everyone is affected. And that, of course, we know is not the case. There are institutions doing wonderful things. There are organisations doing wonderful things. There are families and carers who are incredible and who shouldn't feel at all criticised by the things that come out. But it is the natural tendency for there to be a backlash against people working in the sector when the sector's being criticised and the worst elements of it are being highlighted. And that's something, that the banking sector is experiencing. A lot of staff in that sector feeling very depressed because, they've given their lives to these institutions and it's all being decried as being terrible. And of course that's not the case. So to the extent that you're engaging with organisations and you've got carers and families around you who are sort of feeling like, gee, this is a bit much, it's important that this community also reach out to give each other some positive reassurance and to express our appreciation when we do see really positive things happening, because people are going to need that little bit of moral pick-me-up. What I am also hoping that we will see from this commission is more sensitivity than we saw in the Banking Royal Commission. The Banking Royal Commission was brutal on individuals. I think, and it was brutal on anyone giving evidence really, it was traumatic. Here I think there is much more recognition that some of the people who will tell their stories to this commission have already been deeply traumatised, and there is a lot of sensitivity to making sure that the way that hearings are conducted and evidence is presented is sensitive to that and supportive of those people. And I thought that was a really positive thing to see recognised, because this commission does not want to do more harm to those people. So I'm hoping that we'll see a little more sensitivity. That may mean that we see some times when the commissioners may decide to keep the media out. And sometimes you get criticism when these processes happen about the press being locked out. But that can sometimes be important for individuals to have the space to tell their stories without their personal lives being splashed across the tabloids. So if you see that, remember that sometimes if the commissioners are doing that, they're doing that to protect individuals. And the press may roar about freedom of the press, but actually the commissioners will feel more strongly about protecting vulnerable people who are telling their stories than it will about satisfying journalists. And I think they should. It does want to look at best practice. And so if you have stories of best practice, if there are things to celebrate, now is also the time to tell those stories. It may not necessarily get a lot of attention within the commission, but submissions, particularly if you make them on a non-confidential basis, can be publicly available. And we've seen with other commissions that the rest of the community does draw on those things. It goes back and looks at them, and you'll find institutions looking to some of those submissions for what has been said about best practice. So it can still be very powerful. So I would encourage you to tell your stories about that as well. How to get involved, very importantly. Now, there's a fantastic website for this commission. It's got lots of bits to it, so you find you have to delve through lots of it. But in particular, you can subscribe to it so that you get news updates from it, and I'd encourage you all to register for the updates. You can read through the materials so far, and as I've mentioned, look for the ones that have the easy read versions of some of the legal documents, because they're quite engaging and they tell the story quite well. Particularly if you find the legal documents a little bit off-putting or sort of too wordy, I'd have to take that one on the chin. They do tend to be. So there's a lot of material there, and it will be continually updated. So that's the first place to go for news on all of this. There's also some good material on the Department of Social Services website, which is cross-linking to the Royal Commission website, but it's also got some good material there. At the moment, open for comment is a draft accessibility strategy. And so that's a plan that the Royal Commission has issued to guide it on how to make sure that its processes, its workshops, its forums, its hearings and sittings, that they are fully accessible to the disability community. So if you have strong views on that subject, have a look at the accessibility strategy now. The comments are open until the 13th of September, so just another little under 2 weeks. And you can give comments on it by either emailing that address that's there, which is up on the website, or calling the information line. So if it's easiest for you to give comments verbally, a lot of the commission processes have made that accessible by making sure the comments can be given over the phone on things if you need to, which I think is also a really good advance. Other ways you can get involved, you can attend a community forum. As they pop up and are scheduled, if there's one near your area, you should be able to see it on the website, and there's an online registration form as events become scheduled, or you can register by phone. Those are a little bit limited though. If you go along to those, you probably shouldn't expect there'll be a lot of talking by the community. It'll probably be more sort of information being shared. You can make a submission. This is a really important way of getting involved, and it's the primary way of communicating information into the Commission. So you can tell the story of your experience. Now we've got here some guides on how to make a submission and a submission form. So if you'd like to take one of these with you, you can, but there's lots of different ways to make a submission. So if it's hard for you to use one of these, the hard copy form, there's a form on the website. There's also the ability to make a submission by phone, by ringing that number, or by email. So you can choose the way that actually works best for you. And if the Commission wants to follow up on a submission, if they want you to give evidence, if they'd like to hear more from you about it, they'll contact you. So you can also attend the public sittings, which are hearings. Again, you have to pre-register because there's limited space and it can be a little bit crowded, but you can attend in person. So to do that, you register on the website or you register by phone. These processes, while I said it's not a court, there's still a similarity to court proceedings. They're very formal, very structured. They're not necessarily as entertaining as you might think from seeing court processes on TV. It doesn't go a mile a minute. So even though they've waived the rules of evidence, there's still a lot of formality to it. You can, and I suspect this might be more comfortable, is you can watch the public sittings via webcast. So you can do it in the comfort of your own home with your computer screen, and you might find that's a little bit more enjoyable because you can stop and go and have a cup of tea whenever it suits you. Other ways of getting involved, if there is a great awareness within the Commission that people may find it difficult to engage and to be able to make submissions. Obviously, families and carers will be of great assistance, but there will be a process of formal advocacy support, which should be available. They say September 2019, but they haven't set a date yet, so it'll be sometime in that month. And that's via the Department of Social Services website. So the link is there in the materials if you want it, but it's pretty easy to find on the website as well. So when that opens up, if you need some help, you can apply through that. But you can also talk to organisations like ours. So we have not yet actually reached a view as to whether we are in a position to make a submission ourselves, but we are very happy to support you to either get access to assistance to prepare a submission or to talk through what the process looks like. If we can help, we're always happy to. So if in doubt, you can call us. As I say, you can also join the mailing list to get information about when the support services open up. And if you are asked to speak at a hearing, that's pretty special. So if your story is selected by the Commission to be explored and further investigations conducted, it's pretty special. It's also a little bit stressful. Even as a lawyer who does this stuff as my day job, I find those things a little bit stressful. If you haven't ever done it before, it's a lot more so. So please, if they do reach out to you in that way, make sure that you get some support around you, not just from families and even organisations like ours, but make sure that you reach out and get some assistance from people who've been through these sorts of processes before, so they can explain to you how it's all likely to work. Just takes the anxiety factor down a little bit. As I say, I think the Commission's going to be sensitive to people feeling that way, but it is important to make sure you just don't fly solo going in there, because otherwise it could be a little bit stressful. Okay, we've galloped through at a mile a minute. Does anybody have some questions that they'd like to ask? Down the back, yes.
My name is Bob Nolan.
Hi, Bob.
You probably covered in your excellent talk what I'm about to try to clarify, but I'll go there anyway. I made a verbal submission to the terms of reference.
Yes.
And I have at home a letter telling you or assuring me that I would be sent written notification of when all this stuff was happening and how it was happening. And I'm learning about this today, which concerns me. I'm seeing that with the printouts of these forms, that the only way of submitting them is by pushing a button on a computer. Now,
No, there's other ways. So those particular forms will say to submit the form itself.
Yeah.
You can put it in through the computer, but you can do it by email or you can ring up, and so you can give verbal.
Well, I can ring up, but sort of they don't have that much time. I'm preparing a love letter at the moment for the Minister of Health, and I'm on page about 20 at the moment. But I mean, the point is that the Australian Digital Inclusion Index includes me as somebody who has got problems with screen-based equipment.
Yes.
And includes most people with disability as being the people in Australia with the least access to things like websites.
Yeah.
And it concerns me that all this information can be readily accessed through websites. Yes. But I think you've clarified that there are alternatives, and I'll explore those alternatives later on.
In particular, I think you'll find using the phone link will be helpful, and you can, I think on that phone line you can ask for material, I think, to be sent to you in hard copy, so you can provide an address and so forth. The phone number, for anyone who can't read it easily on the screen, is 1800 517 199. So it's 1800 517 199. That is the same phone number that they use for all of the different links. So that one phone number will see you right on all of the different ways that you might want to engage. So it's the only phone number you should need. That will enable you, for instance, it might be a good idea to give some comments on the accessibility strategy and to make your perspectives about the website access known by phone on that accessibility strategy. So give them a call before the 13th of December, because that issue is currently open and live. 13th of September, sorry, yes. So.
I will be doing that, and sort of we've had a little bit of a week with Family and Community Services and decided to discontinue the companion card members' news, the publication of it, and they have now announced that they are going to restore it as soon as possible.
Okay, that's terrific. That's terrific. Any other questions that anyone has before we wrap up?
Well, otherwise, I think Shannon might be here around lunchtime. We might leave some of those questions to her at that time. But we really thank her for the time today.